Dear friends, welcome to E-Pathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapeeth, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module titled Derivative Nationalism, which is part of Political Sociology paper. In the last module, we had seen how the ideas of Gellner and Anderson regarding the formation of nation and nationalism in Europe was considered central to any theorization on nation. However, this experience of nation building in Europe cannot be aped in the West, in the East, or in the colonized worlds. And therefore, what we must understand is that there was a term called derivative nationalism given by theorists, which was contested by the theorists from the third world. This particular module will try and understand the contestations that revolve around the concept of derivative nationalism. Derivative nationalism. The history of nationalism in post-colonial societies has been put to critical reading by both Western and non-Western scholars. Refuting any unilinear developments as informed by the logic of post-enlightenment rationality, the history of the process of evolution of nationalism in such societies is rendered complex by the colonial past. The commonmost framework to view the developments of nationalist politics in the third world is contained in its definition as derivative discourse. In the works like Partha Chatterji's Nationalist Thought in the Colonial World, a derivative discourse, a critical exposition of the liberal theory of nationalism is included that identifies nationalism in colonized non-European context with being primarily a derivative of the modular or classical type which found its origin in European history. In a similar vein, Dipesh Chakrabarty in his article Nation and Imagination talks about expanding the narrow confines of Europe-sponsored nationalism, imagination by including the heterogeneous practices and experiences of colonial societies. In works of the liberal ideas of nationalism, like The Idea of Nationalism by Hans Kohn and The Two Types of Nationalism by James Plamantz, a common theme is that which colonization, the idea of modular variant of European nationalism, were transferred to colonies which adopted the ideological framework of such a discourse to frame their own nationalist struggle against the colonial rule. However, as has been said before, the transference of a pure political idea like nationalism from a European context to that of the colonial society raises a set of complexities. Again, to consider the liberal accounts of nationalist theory, for example, Ernest Gellner's Nations and Nationalism, where he talks about the idea of nationalism as a modern concept born out of the cultural and social transformations fostered by industrialization in Western countries. It has assumed that those very basic conditions which made nationalism a success ideology in the West, like the progressive forces of industrialism, representative democracy, and culture of rationality, were missing in colonial societies, because of which the resultant nationalism in these contexts was impure and of deviant nature. The assumed deviant nature of third world nationalism in such accounts is a simultaneous reference to a range of things, most highlighted of which is that given the special historical conditions of colonial countries, these societies lack the inherent capacity to successfully cover the path towards modernity. Therefore, the dominant narrative of nationalism in former colonial societies has been one of how it is different from the mainstream Western idea of, as Chatterji puts it, the normal type of nationalism. In the introduction to his work, The Nation and its Fragments, Colonial and Post-Colonial Histories, Chatterji put forward some essential ways in which colonial nationalism put forth the unique confrontation. They challenged the stereotypical claim that the colonized were naturally unendowed with any capacity to rule themselves, and through their respective nationalist movements, ideas and consciousnesses, the colonized displayed a simultaneous potential to also modernize themselves, in turn challenging the so-called exclusivity of power basis of Western colonial rulers. However, Chatterji maintains that both these observations point to a very crucial aspect of the third world nationalisms, that is, there is complex nature. To get back to an earlier point, one of the defining features of third world nationalisms is the recurring aspect of what several scholars like Chatterji call contradictoriness. This contradiction is reflected primarily in the way in which the colonized society tries to frame its own indigenous brand of nationalism. Such an anti-colonial national discourse was premised on a polemic critique of the colonial discourse of the Orient, embodied in the image of non-active, passive, and non-sovereign colonized people and countries. Edward Said, in his work Orientalism, discussed at length how an object of study, the image of the Orient or other, was the main representational form whereby the colonial rulers made sense of colonized people and also controlled them. Consequently, the discourse of Orientalism was accorded the status of a scientific and universal truth that legitimized the power of Western colonizers over non-European people and cultures. The problematic of the Orient in Western colonial thought was challenged by Third World nationalist discourse, which asserted that the representational category of the Orient had a subjectivity which was self-produced, therefore was far from being passive or non-autonomous as projected in the colonial discourse. In all, what the anti-colonial nationalist discourse attempted to do was to create its own framework of alternative reasons and politics with which it could challenge the hegemonic power of colonial rule. However, in building that framework, it imbibed the same premises and representational structure present in the colonial mode of thought. As said earlier, Partha Chatterji elucidates his analytical strategy to understand anti-colonial nationalism of the Third World in the context of colonial India. In the journey of emergence and consolidation of nationalism in the Indian context, he describes three moments: the ideological, political content in the thoughts of Bankim Chandra Chatterji, Gandhi and Nehru, which provide for the construction of the successive stages of nationalist discourse in India. Describing the history of constitution of nationalist discourse in colonial India, Chatterji says that the modest origins were to be found in the development of a new class of intelligentsia that was a product of the colonial system itself, having made the most of the Western system of education and consolidation of the professional administrative class that the British initiated here. It was by the 19th century that this class of professionals and intellectuals first encountered the new structure of law, administration, and principles introduced by the colonizers, and were forced to formulate a response to the transforming structures and systems of the indigenous society. From an initial position of apprehension about the incomprehensibility of the new colonial language and impersonal procedures of the colonial rule, this new class of intelligentsia had come to adapt itself to the changing circumstances, familiarizing itself not only the language but also with the colonial principles of administration and rule. This is recounted by Chatterji as the main medium through which the discourse of nationalism was spread amongst the colonized people. The implications of such a distinct process of spread of an essentially Western idea amongst the colonized through a class of intellectuals that owed its origin to the colonial structure were many and made up for the increasing complexity of nationalist thought in the country. First and foremost, there was a distinct reverence in the developing class of nationalist intelligentsia in the 19th century colonial India towards the European structure of reason and thought that helped the former to frame its own contours. The early nationalists like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay continued to display indebtedness to Western values of modernity, rationality, and objective knowledge that opened their eyes to the very lack in their own culture which made domination of India possible. Consequently, the second important implication was the realization of severe shortcomings in the culture of Indians which made their colonization possible. For example, Bankim maintained that India was colonized because the Indians lacked a natural desire for autonomy. Therefore, even before the advent of the British in India, the country had been consistently subjected to external conquest and rules, especially by Muslim invaders. And this was mainly because of the cultural failure on the part of the Indians to understand the real basis of power in the real world. An additional reason for the subjection of Indian people was the apparent lack of solidarity among the Hindus and a limited devotion to interests of the nation. It was only with the coming of the colonizers that Indians were exposed to the true meanings of national liberation and solidarity. Therefore, for Bankim, the essential power of the Western colonizers lay in their material and civilizational progress, while the essential backwardness of the Indian community was based on its culture lack despite an inept attitude and approach towards material power and force in real political world. In such a frame of thought as reflected in the literary texts of Bankim's like Krishna Charita, Chatterji sees internalization of colonial dichotomy between the West and the East, or between material and cultural. For example, in Bankim's thought, it was the mastery of the West over the real basis of power in the world, that is, material force, against which the cultural weakness of the Indians became explicit. Similarly, the Western structure of reason and knowledge based on principles of objectivity, historicity, science and rationality made them superior to any other culture. Therefore, drawing upon the structure of Europe, thought and reason, Bankim managed to highlight the missing yet imperative aspect in culture that was desirous of liberty. Paradoxical as it may seem, it is the same aspects of European knowledge system that provided a frame of reference for Bankim to launch a critique of colonial subjection of India. Borrowing the same categories of rational and objective science of society provided in the colonial discourse, Bankim sought to prove the distortions of Indian history at the hands of the colonizers. Therefore, through a critique of the Orientalist knowledge, Bankim tried to recover an indigenous or true historical core of India, free of all distortion and fable-making, the history of the nation called India that stood the test of historicity and objectivity as criteria of authentic science. Through the recovery of an original and objective history of India, free of all distortions and manipulations, Bankim succeeded in two things. First, the real strength of India lay in its cultural and spiritual superiority as reflected in its original and authentic history. And second, the culture of India was capable of being reformed in order to prepare it for real world politics. Therefore, there was a critique in Bankim's thought towards the assumed cultural immutability of the Indians. The culture of the colonized India was as capable of modernizing itself so that it preserved what was distinctly Indian while observing at the same time the core values of the modern West. Therefore, according to Partha Chatterji, thus was an attempt to what he terms as translate the modern into the national. The inherent tension between core definition of modernity and that of nationalism was sought to be resolved by a revivalist regeneration of cultural identity of the colonized society so as to make it fit the bill of modern criteria. By appealing to an authentic cultural history of India, Bankim's case for a return to the past must not be dubbed as a return to backward-looking conservative institutions of Hindu society. Rather, the attempt was to modernize and rationalize the cultural institutions of Hindu society to make a departure from the assumed immutability of colonized subjectivity as codified in the colonial discourse. Gandhian politics and the nationalist discourse, the moment of maneuver. Mahatma Gandhi's intervention in the emergent nationalist movement in India has been described by Partha Chatterji as representing the moment of maneuver, whereby the various points of conflict between the ideological political content of anti-colonial nationalist movement in the country and the realm of practical organizational politics was sought to be resolved or temporarily suspended. The realm of practical politics here refers to the structure of bourgeois politics, laws and institutions that frame the boundaries of the nationalist politics in colonial India. The national movement was also a political movement, that is, it had to operate within the overall framework provided by the institutional structure of the colonial state. As Chatterji puts it, Gandhian thought provided for the ideological unity of very contradictory elements within the realm of the nationalist movement. On one hand, the entire nationalist discourse in colonial context India was built upon the fact of its essential difference with worldview of the West, the main force behind it being the force of cultural or spiritual superiority of the colonized. Yet, on the other hand, the political aim of autonomy from colonial domination and self-rule borrowed heavily from the bourgeoisie, liberal institutionalism and statecraft of the colonial discourse itself. In the context of such evident contradictions, Gandhi's contribution to the nationalist discourse is seen primarily in the redefinition of the goal of national liberation along the lines of a moral utopia which was desirable but difficult to attain, but which provided space for politics of accommodation, adjustments, and compromise on path towards the ultimate attainment. According to Chatterji, Gandhi's ideological reconstruction of the goal of national liberation as Swaraj took it much beyond the conventional understanding of nationalism. Unlike the nationalist leaders of his time, Gandhi's critique was not merely directed at the colonial excesses in Indian society. Rather, the thoughts of Gandhi, when read in his works like Hind Swaraj, were in the form of a critique of fundamental aspects of civil society, which, with its attendant ideas of rationality and progress through fast-paced industrialism and material development. Such a critique could be applied simultaneously against both the colonial ideology as well as to the nationalist design of post-independent state building in India. For example, Anthony J. Parel, in his work Gandhi, Hind Swaraj and Other Writings, writes about Gandhi's idea of true Swaraj. For Gandhi, Swaraj meant freedom from external, alien rule, but in addition, there was an inner aspect of the goal of Swaraj, which was freedom of mind from passions that control it, like greed, avarice, violence, etc. Therefore, attainment of Swaraj was contained in not just freedom from British rule, but also in an individual moral and spiritual regeneration. As Raghavan N. Iyer, the moral and political thought of Mahatma Gandhi, chalks out in his writings, Gandhi's ideological disdain towards Western ideas of development and material progress that sustained on forces of competition and profit was reflected in his idealized imagination based on the relocation of the numerous villages in India as the basic unit of any kind of social, political and economic organization. According to Gandhi, a decentralized system of production through labor-intensive and small-scale village industries was probably the only recourse in a country of teeming millions, characterized by chronic condition where productive labor far exceeded availability of sufficient employment. According to Chatterji, Gandhi's critique of fundamental aspects of modern civil society must not be reduced to being kind of romantic or idealistic critique of excesses of Western material civilization. Gandhi was much more than just a peasant intellectual who advocated the return to harmony of a simplistic rural life, free of the evils of material consumerism and greed. Gandhi's idealism had a political contribution to make in the construction of a nationalist state in India. The foremost contribution of Gandhian discourse was to forge an ideological unity within the framework of the nationalist movement over and above the existent internal contradictions within Indian society. These internal contradictions in the form of divisions between different social classes in the complex and layered agrarian society in India, displaying varying degrees of inequality and discrimination, were probably the biggest roadblock in nationalist reconstruction of the nation. Therefore, the peasant communal tilt in Gandhian thought helped to realize a historical possibility, that is, of fostering an ideological unity between the subaltern peasant classes and the elite nationalist section in the course of a developing a national struggle. In important works like David Hardiman's Gandhian in His Times and Ours, there is included a critical analysis of Gandhian principle of trusteeship in the propertied class and his condemnation of the Jati system as the distortion of the principle of Varna Vyavastha. These very Gandhian formulations appear in the nationalist history of the country as similar points of maneuver, whereby Gandhi was able to reconcile the otherwise irreconcilable internal contradiction in pursuit of goal of national independence. The mobilization of the subaltern classes to rally behind the elite nationalist leadership, which showed clear allegiance to bourgeoisie model of development, was made possible only by Gandhian politics. Nehruvian nationalism and passive revolution, the moment of arrival. The entry of the process of reconstruction of nationalist discourse in India in its mature phase, when all the contradiction was smoothened out, has been termed as the moment of arrival in the life of the national state. Partha Chatterji talks of this phase when the singular theme of the national state takes over the entire terrain of political and social life of the country. In the works of Benjamin Zachariah, like Developing India, an Intellectual and Social History, we get a glimpse of Nehruvian model of nationalist development with its central ideas of national state, national development, and equal citizenship rights to one and all, irrespective of language, education, caste, sex, and religion, that came to capture the attention of public imagination on the eve of independence in 1947. Such an arrival is most reflected in Nehruvian politics, the outlines of which can be read in his work like The Discovery of India and an autobiography. Along with it comes the moment when the emergent national state, with all its trappings of modernity, come face to face with its inescapable other in the form of vast sections of peasantry that needed to be appropriated and mobilized in the elite nationalist project of planned industrial development of the national economy. As discussed in his work Development, Planning and Indian State, Partha Chatterji discusses the politics of passive revolution by the Indian ruling classes in the post-independence India, played out to acquire legitimacy of the subaltern classes in the grand project of nation building and modernization. The unfolding of the universal narrative of the modern state in India was far from being a smooth process. Certain inescapable conditions posed as hindrances in its smooth transition. The conceptualization of a singular national community had to look for ways to deal with pre-existing forms of communities and consciousness that existed amongst the colonized subjects' populations. Peasantry as a community, and often a rebellious one, was a specific problem which made their absorption in the nationalist anti-colonial struggle ever important. Peasantry as backward, superstitious and ignorant, unsuited to the dynamics of modern times, was a perception shared by the colonizers and nationalists alike. Likewise, the identity of class of peasantry as the troublemaker because of its rebellious nature was another image internalized by both colonialists and nationalists. Then there was the question of caste. Caste as a marker of the so-called traditional society in India represent hierarchy, rigidity and backwardness, which threatened to deny the country opportunities of modern self-governance. This was a widely held belief of the colonizers, on the basis of which they justified their hold over in colonial India. For the nationalists, it was only proper to deny that caste was a core feature of Indian society. However, it was the institution of caste that made the Indian society essentially different from the West, and in such perception, caste as an ideal system based on functional division of labor that brought order and stability in society was stressed upon. According to Chatterji's piece on peasantry and the nationalist movement, in his book The Nation and its Fragments, both positions of the nationalists concerning the caste question were well placed within the framework of modernity. Liberal equality and entrenched within bourgeoisie modernity called for condemnation of oppressive caste practices, while the later position maintained that caste in its ideal form was not incompatible with principles of universal modernity. The institution of caste as contributing to maintaining unity and stability of social order is, in the words of Chatterji, a synthetic theory of caste. Synthetic theories of caste naturalize the condition of relations of dominance and subordination that constitute the principle of hierarchy between numerous castes. By stressing instead upon the ideology of dharma, which determines the unity of mutual separateness and mutual dependence between jatis, such theories enable a continued reproduction of the caste system. The construction of a nationalist culture on basis of such synthetic theories of caste turns its back against an immanent critique of caste, which renders futile even formal recourse offered by the legal framework of bourgeois freedom and equal rights. As far as the question of peasantry was concerned, the importance of appropriating the peasantry for rendering a mass appeal to the nationalist movement was recognized more than ever. However, the structure of peasant politics was way different from the nationalist politics, which made such appropriation a difficult process for the nationalists. Peasant politics, as the other of the formal realm of national politics with roots in bourgeoisie institutional frameworks, often posed as a challenge before the latter. Therefore, the nationalists in their approach to the peasants were no different from the colonizers. The peasants were turned into objects of their strategies with no voice or agency of their own. This meant that as peasants were sought as appropriated within the new discourse of the nation, they were sheared away of any consciousness of their own. Any kind of mobilization amongst the peasantry was relegated to the cultural sphere, lacking organization and sense of politics. Peasants were persistently approached by the nationalists as the population that needed to be controlled and led, even if as a part of anti-colonial movement. This partly grew out of a deep-rooted sense of suspicion and distrust that the nationalist leadership harbored for the peasantry, supposedly ignorant and backward as they seemed to the former. The contours of the domain of bourgeoisie politics, as adopted by the modernizing elite, failed to grasp the specifics of peasant politics and consciousness. Therefore, as Chatterji says, the historical narrative of modernity and that of the modern state refuse to see the peasantry is active subject of history, which placed considerable challenge before both colonial and nationalist historiographies by its forms of actions and consciousness. The coming into being of a nation in the Indian context involved a politics whereby the domain of politics and the peasants was kept invisible and detached from the concrete political processes, and hence denied any historical subjectivity. To conclude, therefore, this module tried to understand how nationalism in India emerged. According to Partha Chatterji, it emerged at 3 stages, and 3 important personalities were involved in the formulations of these ideologies of nationalism. The first being Bankim Chattopadhyay, the second being Mahatma Gandhi, and the third being Nehru, who was more of a modernist. Similarly, we have also seen that theorists such as Dipesh Chakrabarty also debunks the myth of derivative nationalism. Rather, this nationalism was a contested form of nationalism that emerged in India. Thank you.